As I said before, my name is Frank Weisenberger. I'm convening the Community of Practice Conservation Standard projects on Indigenous land and waters, and I'm calling in today from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay, before we start off, my respect to elders past, present, and emerging leaders. And we are a small group, so we should be able to manage. But if anybody has any technical difficulties throughout, hit up Stuart while I'm presenting at the first part. We will be mostly kind of looking here at Zoom, but the breakout session or whatever we're going to do for the breakout session is going to be in Mirror, so we're going to shift them to a different platform. What we had in mind is pretty straightforward, and we've done the welcome introductions. I'm going to give a really super brief project background. And since this is the last of many webinars of this project, and most people would have heard how it came about. And then the first part of the webinar, I'm going to give you guys a quick overview on principles, practices, and guidance that we identified and distilled from a literature review on how we can improve conservation, that conservation is supporting Indigenous people and local communities being in a leadership role for conservation initiatives that happen on their land, waters, and ice. And yeah, we're going to probably take about 15 minutes or so to look at those principles that we have distilled from a literature research and literature review. And then the majority of today's session, we want to focus on two prototype tools that we developed based on the input and feedback we received from everyone over the course of webinars we held in July and in May and really early in the year and in February. And for that, so it is two tools. We have to see how we're going to do it with the breakout session or not such a small number of people. And then at the end, we're just going to explain how people can leave feedback and talk a little bit about next steps with this project. For those of you who are, I guess, newish to the world of the conservation standards and the conservation coaches network, a lot of the things, like everything from the conservation standards on to all the tools we talk about, they live and they mature over time and get better as they are used more often. And that's kind of as well our hope that what we have developed in isolation with your feedback and that this gets used by people and we can get some good feedback so that we can improve those tools and make them really meaningful. Super quick project context. We all are aware of those big global initiatives like 30 by 30 and others, and those different country national initiatives that derive from 30 by 30. And we know and we all are aware of the significant role that Indigenous people in local communities play as stewards for very high biodiversity places with incredibly high conservation values that they've been looking after for millennia. And while, because of the importance, more and more guidance is developed on how we can partner with Indigenous people and local communities, we identified at the outset of this project that there's very little guidance and tools on how can you actually adapt adaptive management approaches. And when we talk here broadly about adaptive management approaches, I mean, I guess the conservation standards as the unifying thing across all of us here in particular, that there's not too much guidance on how can you actually implement an adaptive management framework that actually fosters equitable and self-determined and community-led conservation. And out of that kind of a shortage of guidance came this project where the Nature Conservancy, and Sebastian is the project manager from Nature Conservancy side, and collaborated with the Conservation Coaches Network, so the Community of Practice Conservation Standards Project on Indigenous lands and waters. And the organization Stuart represents our common place to develop those resources and address this gap, to come up with new tools to support the planning or implementation of self-determined conservation strategies within TNC, but as well more broadly across all of Conservation Coaches Network. And I guess we all know that in order to honor Indigenous people and Indigenous community leadership in conservation, we need to shift the way how we are approaching conservation. And we need to shift to an approach that is a lot more empowering and that promotes Indigenous and community people, community-led conservation and their leadership. While we are fully aware that conservation always depends on the local context, on the local cultural context of the people that you work with in different parts of the world, there are still some overarching principles that apply. So while we do not want to standardize the world when it comes to people, because this is never good, and we want to kind of provide a starting point with the resources we developed to kind of to start a discussion and to kind of to initiate this shift of how we work, acknowledging that the local context is always the most important one. So we're developing as part of these projects 4 major outputs, and they all build on each other and are interconnected. What we're going to start off in this presentation is what we kind of now became or now started having the title of being the volume 1 of the outputs, our principles and planning. That is a bit of a foundational document, I'd say, a document that you would want to use when you start out in your career of conservation and when you shift towards working with Indigenous people in local communities. It's a foundational document, and it is built on an extensive literature research that looks at trying to distill different principles, identify for principles how they can be applied in practice, so define some practices, and then make recommendations for tools and show some examples how those are applied in real life, in real world. There is a second document that is more for the conservation practitioner who is engaging in a project or who is just starting out on a project specifically. So this is more of practical guidance, and it uses the same principles and practices, but it takes a different perspective and it looks at them from the adaptive management steps. So from the conservation standards. If you are in that step of the conservation standards, what would you want to consider when it comes down to certain principles and practices that support leadership of Indigenous people and local communities? And building around those 2 different viewpoints on those principles and practices, we developed as well 2 tools. The first tool was developed by Valentina Varon, a esteemed colleague from Colombia who is not on this call because it's the middle of the night over there. She developed a pre-planning and team readiness tool. As the name of the tool suggests, something that you would use before a planning project starts in the pre-planning phase, and it looks at the different principles across the pre-planning step. And secondly, we got a tool that's titled the Spectrum of Engagement tool that Stuart developed. That is a tool that looks at where are you on the spectrum of engagements with Indigenous people and local communities when you are already in a project. So either you have just finished your planning project, you want to know where you're sitting, or you're in the process, in the middle of it all, and you want some guidance and some direction where you can improve. And I guess this bundle of tools altogether we developed to support more leadership of Indigenous people and local communities. And to first of all, I guess, distill the different principles of planning, we did an extensive literature review of human rights literature, partnership management literature, adaptive management literature, and so forth. And we looked at the commonalities, like there is clearly a lot of commonalities across a lot of those publications, and that was the basis for us to kind of come up and categorize 8 key principles. And those principles are not sequential, or they're not numbered and prioritized in any way. We do not think that there is kind of a one principle that is more important than the other. They are all important altogether. And across the lifespan of an adaptive management project, and those principles pop up in like an orchestra, like they're all in an interplay. Those principles don't only come up once and then you can park them and never think about them. They are continuously kind of in the background. Some are foundational, they apply to every step. Some are a bit more specific, they apply very specifically to a step. So what did we come up with? There is, and we're going to look into more of the details of the principles in the following slides, just a quick overview. So trust and relationship is one of those. The free, prior, informed consent of communities, diversity and respect in planning, honoring cultural identity in external contexts, the recognition of and the knowledge of Indigenous people and local communities, accountability, adaptability and learning, equity and inclusion, and self-determination, governance and sovereignty. So those are all, and I would assume they make good sense to most people, like we all stumble across them a lot. But what we've often experienced is that how people think about implementing them depends a lot more on personal interpretation and how you apply them and how you make them happen in your project. And for that, we went one step deeper in the mud and we looked at those principles. And we've tried to figure out, so how can you put this principle actually in practice, and what are the practices that help you get there? So on the screen on the top, so the principle trust and relations, so the foundational engagement based on respect and transparency. One way of building this trust and relations is about engaging regularly, early, transparently, and in good faith to build relationships and foster continuity. There is a number of different ways how you can make that happen and how you can support this practice. There's also another practice, and this is more around recognizing the product goals that the local community has and the priorities that they have for a project, and don't come predetermined with your plan and only that plan, and rather co-design a process before you create any content. And again, in a similar way, there are different tools and practices and facilitation tips that are associated with it. And for the purpose of those 8 principles, we walked through from the first principle to the last principle. For example, the principle of free, prior, informed consent, catchword that we all know, and the right to give and to also withhold consent. Oops, I need to adjust that. So it's about facilitating a meaningful dialogue and revisiting and reviewing consent throughout the process. Tools that you can use is like developing consent roadmaps. It's about identifying and confirming the legitimate rights holder and identify the right decision makers and decision-making structures before you engage, so that you feel comfortable you're engaging with the right people. And it's also about providing information in a way that is accessible, that people can understand and actually make an informed decision, and providing sufficient time to deliberate. Sorry, just admitting someone. There is the principle of self-determination in governance and ensuring that we recognize the rights holder and the decision makers. In that process, ensuring that we recognize community priorities, provide sufficient resources as part of the engagement, as a part of the project, to support and strengthen internal governance and decision-making, and to honor local decision-making structures and uphold the authority and autonomy and sovereignty of Indigenous people. Diversity and respect is very obvious. A community is nothing that is consists only out of one kind, one grouping, but it is many different voices with many different lived experiences, worldviews, and cosmologies. That's about ensuring the who you're engaging with, to ensure that you have participation across age, gender, social groups within a community. You achieve diversity and respect as well through how they're participating, by creating safe and respectful spaces for dialogue, and by amplifying voices that are normally not heard so often in the planning process, and ensure that those decisions and those voices are considered when decisions in the projects are made. It's closely linked to the next principle about equity inclusion. We ummed and ahed early on whether they're one or whether they're two, but we decided they are actually separate. While diversity and respect is a lot about the who you engage with, and equity and inclusion much more is the how do you kind of look at that from a structural way that you can equitably engage. So that's about ensuring that the structure, like the tools and the processes, are culturally relevant and made for the situation. It's about addressing structural issues that hinder people from participating, and it is about supporting benefit sharing mechanisms that actually consider the diversity of a community and are equitable across, and the benefits coming from conservation projects are shared equitably across the different groups within a community. The recognition of knowledge very clearly is an important principle, since we all understand that Indigenous people bring to the table thousands and thousands of years of experience and knowledge that are valid knowledge systems that sit side by side with contemporary or Western knowledge systems. So it's about the protection of intellectual property rights, ensuring that cultural knowledge is used and handled safely in a way that is in agreement with cultural protocols and what the community wants out of it. Ensuring that your planning actually is validating and elevating traditional ecological knowledge systems or indigenous knowledge systems by incorporating them into your planning framework. And yeah, sorry, that's the second part, and adapting those concepts and tools to incorporate them in your framework to ensure that you amplify that knowledge and put it side by side. And we're coming close to the end. The second last one is around accountability and adaptability and learning, to ensure that the way how you assess and evaluate your adaptive management framework is done in accordance with community feedback, but also that what you monitor, what you measure, what you look at is something that is co-defined by the community and does not only rely on Western scientific knowledge, but also includes the knowledge of Indigenous people and local communities equally. And I guess that when a project is happening, and this is kind of partially the issue with often that adaptive management projects encounter, is that you continue with regularly reviewing, but regularly reviewing with the communities and reporting back to the communities to inform them how a project is happening over the lifetime of it. And last but not least, the eighth principle is around ensuring that Indigenous or local cultural identity is honored in external multi-stakeholder processes, that Indigenous people and local communities can maintain their cultural identity when engaging with non-Indigenous administrative and official roles. That's about ensuring that engagement is adapted to cultural norms, and also that language, the use of ceremony or storytelling where appropriately, is used in that engagement to ensure that local culture is celebrated and seen as something important. So in a nutshell, And knowing that this was a lot to digest, and there are 8 principles. Each principle has between 2 or 3 different practices that we saw as the key practices, how they can be implemented. And each of them has different facilitation tips, conservation standards, tools, or the tools that Valentina and Stuart have developed to help enforce and strengthen those principles when doing planning. How does that now look then in reality? And this is the first part of the guidance material, where we want to kind of give a brief definition, a bit bigger and larger definition than what was just given in this quick webinar. Definition of the principle, why it matters in the planning process, and then identify in particular those practices that help us to implement the principles, and equally show an example for how did somebody actually go about and implement it in real life. And for that purpose, and I'll talk to that about in the next slide a little bit longer, we developed 3 case studies that help visualize those practices and principles. And we want to give a reference to facilitation tip, activity, or tool. We're trying to keep this, as we said, as a foundational document. And this is supplemented from a practitioner level by a second document. Let's go to the second document, the practical guidance document, as we said. And that, sorry for jumping around here, that looks, the second volume, as we said, looks at the principle and practices from the adaptive management steps, from the adaptive management frameworks. And for those of you who are familiar with the conservation standards, you can see on the side something we borrowed from the light conservation standards, or the conservation standards cookbook, that looks at the different phases. And for that document, we want to take a different perspective, as I mentioned. We want to look at the adaptive management step, why you're doing this step very briefly, and referencing the conservation standards accordingly, how you would do it, who should be involved, and then look at the different foundational principles and step-specific principles, how at the different steps you can apply the practices to support community leadership, provide facilitation tips and links to tools and other support material, and also create a reference for the case study so that a practitioner can then think about how they can adapt the conservation standards in their planning project. So, and we're still collating all this information. We want to try and provide a good enough option, just the bare minimum, but equally provide some hints how you can create a richer option for that. And that, I guess, kind of accumulates the guidance documents: foundational, practical, and now we come to the fun part of this webinar, and that is rather looking at the tools that were developed to support those 2 guidance documents. As we mentioned, there are 2 tools. Valentina developed a pre-planning and team readiness tool. It's kind of a decision tree that helps projects in the pre-planning and the team readiness phase to ensure that they have ticked some of the foundational boxes, and to ensure that there's trust and clarity of rights and leadership before a project actually begins. We're gonna talk about the tool in more detail possibly later when we make a vote on how we want to go about looking at the tools. It is for community members as much as for external partners like NGOs or funding agencies as well. It works on 3 different levels and looks, or it works on 3 different branches. It looks at pre-planning and team readiness from a community member's point of view, from an external partner's point of view, but also from a funding agency's point of view. And with that, I'll hand over to Stuart to talk a little bit about what the spectrum of engagement tool is about.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Frank. Yeah, so the idea of the spectrum of engagement tool is to think about pretty much what it says is what level of engagement is actually happening with a community, what level of participation and what level of ownership does an Indigenous or local community have over the process. There are many spectrums of engagement. We've sort of simplified to a fairly straightforward one. And the idea is that you can use this tool to say, looking across these principles, where are we in terms of no engagement or not enough engagement to yes, it's genuinely community led in relation to each of those principles. And the idea is, like any of these sorts of tools, to help you understand where you are or help a community understand where they are, and then to provide some guidance on, well, look, how do I improve from where I am? Or if I'm already doing great, what do I keep doing? Like the other tool, I mean, they should be available for anybody to pick them up at any point. So, but the kind of design idea here, particularly that we're working with, is wanting to support particularly some of the practitioners who might be unfamiliar working in this context. People who are wanting to improve how they work with Indigenous peoples and local communities, but it's also there for communities as well. The idea of this is, as Frank said, it's not so much to help you come into a project, although it could be used that way if you have a look at some of the background material. But it's really to help you understand, I'm in a project, where am I at, or to evaluate it at a particular stage, or things like that. So you could use it for external evaluation or just adaptive review, as it says, or self-assessment. And if those of you who are familiar with it, the old conservation action planning capacity assessment tool, it's intended to be a conversation, but you can also do it as an individual. Frank?
Okay, so now what we had planned is we break into two groups and look at different tools. I'd say, given the number of people, let's just see, let's get a vote maybe from you guys. Is there a tool that you are more interested in? Because then we can just look at it all together in one group, or if there's equal interest in both tools, we can still break into very small groups. What do you guys think? Sorry, Stuart?
I was just going to say, while people are thinking that, I mean, a third alt is that if everyone just wants to see both, is that we just quickly run through them and then provide links for people to make comments subsequently.
I think we have time to go a little bit deeper on both, and maybe could start with the spectrum since you were the one that developed that, Stuart. But I see that Celeste was putting that also in the chat. Yeah,
All right.
because it helps also to see the interconnection between tools. So as you like.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the difference, of course, just so understood. And Frank's popped the Miro link in the chat, so please wander in and have a look. And in a moment.
Yeah, I will.
So Frank, you're the owner of the board, so if you can come down to the spectrum space, and then bring everyone to you, that would be really good.
Yeah, I will. Let me just reconnecting.
Yeah, so because we're a small group, as Frank said, the idea was we'd split into two, and you'd have a full sort of 40 minutes to look at this and make some comments along the way. We've got 40 minutes to look at the two. So my suggestion is that we'll just go through what it is, how it looks, what it's trying to say, and then you'll have access to the board and access to the materials, and then perhaps we can get some initial feedback, sure, but then can comment in more detail later. That would be my suggestion. Well, I might just share my screen as well, Frank, if that's all right. Do you reckon?
Sure. Sorry, I'll just look. You
just
can do that. I'll
you
just
do
let
that?
you. Yeah. Next. Right, you should be able to share, Stuart.
Okay. Hey, there we go. Look at that jackpot. Okay. So.
Okay, and that's where we want to be. So you can see on your screen pretty much two big areas. There is on the top with a kind of a greenish frame one, but the one that Stuart worked on is the one below that is called Tool Stuart. And let me just bring everyone here.
Everyone to me, that'd be great.
This feels so powerful. I like it when everybody comes to me.
Yeah, terrific. All right. So I'm just going to walk you all through that. In practice, this tool is set up as an Excel tool because Excel, and it makes it very transportable and easy. It's relatively small. I'm just going to take you through the steps of it: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and talk you through how it works and what it talks about. There's a few words, a lot of words. I'm sorry about that, but there's a lot of big ideas here that we're trying to make accessible to people who just to give some guidance without them having to really wade through a mountain of material. So the idea of the tool is that it takes the principles, pulls them through the spectrum, and I'll talk about what I mean by the spectrum in a moment. And that gives us a sense of practices that we expect. So for this principle, for this stage of the practice, for this stage of the spectrum, we would see these kinds of practices. We then look at those practices in terms of behaviour. That will give us an assessment of where people are at in terms of how they're working on that spectrum. And then we push out a report which just says, here's how you're ranking and here's some things you might do. So I'm just going to step you through this sequence, basically. So the principles, of course, we've just looked at. So, and as Frank said, each of these principles has a short description and a much more detailed description. That's all provided so people can read those detailed descriptions and know what they're talking about. But I'm not going to revisit that because we just have. From there, as I say, we take the principles and we look through the spectrum. So here's the spectrum. Those of you who are familiar with things like Arnstein's ladder of participation and so on, and there are various other spectrum guides of engagement, we'll probably find some of these things familiar. What we're basically talking about, we've tried to make it simple. You can have many more categories. Conservation standards often has lots of 4-category things, so we're sticking with 4 categories. And of course, this is all about trying to strengthen Indigenous and community leadership. So we're trying to get up here to number 4. That's very much the intent. You may not get there, but this is designed to sort of move you along. So we have 4 levels of participation. So something is entirely externally led at the far side. So that means that, the activities have been initiated, designed and controlled by external actors. So there's a definition of what that means, how you might diagnose it. So this would tell us it's externally led, and what some of the risks of sitting there are. If you're trying to run a project and it's externally led, then you're not going to meet your human rights commitments. You're not doing FPIC. You're probably not going to meet equitable outcomes. There's a whole bunch of problems you're going to generate. So for that's the same for each of the different levels of the spectrum. So we go from externally led to some sort of consultative approach, then collaborative shared leadership, and then Indigenous community-led or self-determined leadership. And for each one, what is it? How do you diagnose it? What's the risk? So that gives us our two fundamental inputs. These are the principles. This is the spectrum of engagement. And I'm hoping that most people, as I say, are sort of roughly familiar with these sorts of things. They're fairly, fairly common. From there, and sorry, I'll just show you this. Under each one, I've got a few sticky notes. So if you're not familiar with Miro, when you get a chance, it'd be great. Or even while we're going through it, feel free to throw comments in. Don't be shy. If something comes up, just grab a sticky note, pop it where you want. Maybe put your initials there or your name if you want to be identified, or do it anonymously. If Rudy doesn't, it's fine. But just put your comments in your sticky note. That'd be great. And that way we can pick up thoughts along the way or later on when you come back in. So principles times spectrum. That gives us then a whole bunch of practices. So really, as tempting as it is to go through all of these, and this is the small one, I'm just going to give you an example of what we're talking about. So if we look up here, we've got our spectrum at the top, externally led, consultative, so on and so forth. We've got our principles down the side, and the diagnostic description is, what does it mean? So externally led means external parties hold decision-making authority, etc. And what does that mean for trust and relationships? If it's externally led, it means that externally actors are initiating engagement. Contact occurs for project needs, transaction, basically, just transaction process, the old, ATM approach. If you want to move up to consultative participatory approaches, then regular consultation and courteous communication. If you want to move further, then you've got joint relationship management. If you want to move all the way to the end, you've got long-term trust-based relationships maintained and led by community priorities. So this gives you an idea of the sort of practices that we would expect to see that demonstrate that principle along this spectrum. These are the short versions. For each one of these, there's a detailed explanation as to what it means and why. Again, that's just not in here for the moment because, words. But for each of the principles, there's a practice to think about across each of those. The language is still a bit clunky. We still need to improve that. I think high English and stuff like that. But at least we want to get the sort of foundation in, and then we can look to improve. Comments, greatly appreciated. So we've got our principles times our spectrum gives us our practice. Terrific. So then we want people to sort of figure out where they are on the spectrum. But what we wanted to do with that was not just say, hey, where do you think you're at on the spectrum? Because that's a silly question. For all sorts of reasons, you might find that, people just want to say, well, no, look, my interpretation of this is that I've got long-term trust-based relationships. I'm just going to say I'm there. So instead of doing that, what we want to do is evaluate how people are thinking about that in terms of their behaviour. So we're asking behavioural questions rather than where are you on the spectrum, the participation spectrum. So I hope everyone's keeping up. I'm sorry if I'm whizzing along a bit quickly. Please yell at me if it's not making sense. I'll pull up after this one and just check in. So we've got our principles, we've got our spectrum, we've got our practices, but we still don't know where we sit. So then what we want to do is, for each of the principles, we're asking these questions in terms of three types of behaviours: the extent, how far a practice occurs; the consistency, how reliable and sustained is it, and how formal or structured is it? How embedded is it? And so by asking about extent, we're trying to test between it's just ad hoc, it only happens when I need to do something, versus it's systematic and ongoing. It's a built-in behaviour. Consistency, same sort of thing. It's contrasting that sort of inconsistent here and there and so on, and versus enduring. And formalities. I need to work on that term, but it's really about going from, it'll be okay. Let's not formalise it. Let's not put an agreement together. We'll just get on with the work, versus something that's really structured and really clear and really explicit, so that it can be, referred back to and so on. I think that's it. So that's, this is the first part of sort of setting it up, I guess. These are all the elements of the setup of the tool. What's the principle? What's the practice? What's the behaviour? And then the next step is, put that into a bit of an evaluative tool. I'm just going to pause for a moment there. I think I've got a couple of minutes to do this, but if any kind of burning questions at the moment or any immediate thoughts, otherwise I'll just keep pushing forward. No? Okay. Again, please, I can see some comments there, which is great. It's fantastic. So thank you for your comments. More comments, more better. So please, don't be shy, and we'd love to get your feedback on structure, content, the whole shooting match.
And we appreciate as well that we're overloading you with information, and this mirror board is accessible outside of the session as well. So once we wrap up today's webinar, we'll send out an email to everyone who registered, so everyone has ongoing access. It's not only now and then never.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah. So then from there, basically, I said it was Excel because, Excel. So all that translates into, a fairly simple looking, Q&A. So for trust and relationships, here's a question about extent. There's a simple drop down, which is a 1 to 4 scale, and you record your reason for your rating. So, if you actually want to go through and, look at it in a bit more detail, it looks like this. But you've got rarely, not at all, sometimes, or emerging. So, trust and relationships, to what extent are relationships established early and maintained throughout the work? Rarely, not at all, sometimes, emerging, often and shared, always community-led. So it's a 4-point scale. That scale translates into numbers because, again, it's CAP, and those numbers generate a result, but that result also helps us do a couple of other things. So I'll take you to that. So in the Excel, we got to provide 2 levels of report. At the minute, we've got the medium level, the more detailed ones, kind of work in progress. The first level of this report is just simply, okay, what did I rate myself in terms of each of the principles, and how I'm going in terms of delivering each of those principles. What level am I at? So, and from an evaluative point of view, I would say, well, if you're getting this kind of result, you really need to focus on trust and relationships and equity and inclusion. You should focus on self-determination, governance, and accountability. And these other ones are going okay for the moment. You could do better, but these ones are your critical areas where you need to build some capacity and capability. But then what we've done is we can then link that to some suggested practices, and you can set yourself a bit of a goal. So trust and relationships, I'm currently at level 1. That means this. I really need to do this practice, and this will then connect to the facilitation tips. And this is where I'm trying to get to, so I'm trying to get from this one to this one. So just pulls all that information together and gives you it's not a comprehensive work plan of this is how you need to do it, but at least it's a fairly accessible guide to, I'm here, I need to think about doing these things to get to there. And as I say, we'll connect that to as Frank was talking about before, facilitation tips and so on. That would be the more detailed output. So this would be a nice quick summary. Here's where we're up to. So as a team, take you an hour. Here's where we're up to. This is what we need to focus on. And then a more detailed one would give you, okay, these are the facilitation tools we should think about. Let's put together a bit of a plan and so on. As I say, this all bundles up as an Excel because and it's because it's easily transportable. Most people have got it. Most people can use it. Most of this you don't see, or you see it if you want to see it. Really, primarily, you go into here, into the actual ratings and the results. But of course, if you want to read what the definitions are of things and so on, you can access them. All right, I'm going to pull up there, Frank, because that's used up a fair bit of time. Okay. That's the spectrum of engagement tool.
Everybody needs to love a good spreadsheet.
I mean, who doesn't, Frank?
Yeah. Those of you who've been around the conservation standard for a long time, for me, my first encounter with the conservation standards was the Excel spreadsheet that Greg Lowe developed for conservation action planning, which was a beast. And so I'm always glad when people go into beast mode and create more tools. We have one question from Celeste here. So when this tool is, when all the outputs from this project are finalized, what we hope will be very early in 2025, the tools and all the materials become broadly available for everyone to adapt and to use in the in the spirit of the Conservation Coaches Network. The tool is there, it's available, it's there for improvement, and it will get better over time as well. Like, we do not expect that what we've developed on the first run is all gold. It will become gold as more people use it and improve it and polish it nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, version 1 of many.
All right. What should we do? Should we have a look at the other tool as well, or do we want to talk a bit more while we have Stuart here about the tool of engagement? How's everyone's feeling?
I think people wanted to have a look at the other one as well.
Okay, sure. And this gives me an option to yet again bring everyone to me.
Hey.
And so they were coming. Fantastic.
Love that for you.
Let me just share as well my screen. But no, actually, I don't need to. That is a good thing because we have the slides already in there. So, as I said earlier on, while Stuart's tool is for projects that are underway, here it is a case for when a project is in the pre-planning phase before it has commenced. Oh, sorry, my computer is just slowing up a bit here. So this pre-planning and team readiness tool is for that phase. Let me get across. If you want, and you want to learn more about it, you can click on the little slides button there, and it starts, if needed, a small a presentation that shows you how the tool works. There's also a link. The tool is HTML driven and that you can look at and play with. So the tool starts off with a few gateway questions that helps orientate a project where it belongs. So those gateway questions are, for one, to determine that it is for projects that are at the outset, so in the pre-planning phase. And secondly, it is it is there to help us identify who is using the tools and who is doing this pre-planning and team readiness. And there are pretty much three different branches. One, how is that looking from a community perspective? Two, how is it looking from the perspective of an external partner, environmental NGO working with projects on Indigenous people in local communities territory, or a funder that is providing the funding for an environmental NGO who is doing a project with community. And for those kind of the three branches, there are 6 core actions that this tool is trying to assess a team's readiness to commence planning. And that's around listening to the territory, ensuring that the priorities of the communities are considered, recognizing your place, like the role that you play as a facilitator and how you collaborate, clarifying the right, the scope, and the consent of the project you're doing, designing the team and establishing, designing the process and establishing the team, and also assessing whether people are ready to work together and to commit to a project. And this information is pretty much as simple, and this decision-making tree is based on yes/no questions. When you say yes, you kind of you come to the next question. If you say no, it opens up a few guidance cards that give you some guidance questions, that give you some facilitation tips and some due diligence. And that together then kind of brings you to determine where you are sitting. So in a similar fashion, like you work through the different aspects, you have your yes/no logic, and then you get a output at the end, like we call it a checkpoint, that tells you for all those areas where you click no, what you could do to improve and how you can implement that on the outset before you start your planning, before you engage, to set everything up in the right context. Below are this screenshot and similar way of providing feedback. As with Stuart's tool, there's a number of post-it notes for things that people like, things that we need to improve, or suggestions or questions where something is not clear. But pretty much, as I said, the way it works is if you click in the tool on yes, you end up on the next question, on the next core action. If you click no, you get like the small screenshot at the bottom where you kind of see a few guiding questions, a few key components, activities, and due diligence as little tabs that you can use and inquire more. And I'd say, because it is way more fun to do that live, I'll just show you how that looks like. Oops, sorry. And then that's the one. Let me share my screen. Gosh, this is slow. I'm sorry, my computer's been on for too long by the looks of it. I want this screen. And I want this too. Come on, open. I am not opening. Gosh. It's opening 6 times. Come on. There we go. My internet is extremely slow. I apologize. So we go through your assessment. Hope you can see the screen. So we are in the pre-planning phase. we are working in a project with Indigenous people. And then there comes the first question, whether the project is initiated from within the community, from the outside, or collaboratively. Let's just say this is a project that an environmental NGO has recommended. And that's when you kind of split into one of the three pathways. And this is the pathway for, I'm going to show you, for an external NGO member. The first question for you is like, was the engagement initiated based on trust and prior listening with rights holders before this project came about? If you would say yes, as I mentioned before, you come to the next question. But if you say like, "Ooh, I'm not sure, tell me more about it," and you click on the no, show me more button, you kind of get this little pop-up screen on your screen where you have some reflection questions to ask yourself how you can look at the topic of listening to the territory and incorporating community priorities and co-designing. There are some key components, things that you should be doing when engaging with people, with communities. A number of activities that we're still fine-tuning that you can do. And then equally some due diligence checklist stuff like, have you done this? Have you done this? As a quick thing to go through. As you kind of digest all this information, when you have reviewed all the prompts, the tool will then bring you to the second question. And that asks you kind of like, what is your role? How are you sitting in the equation with communities? Like, are you a partner? Are you a leader? What's your role? Similar fashion, yes brings you to the next question. No will help you kind of find some of those clarifying questions to think about how you go about this step. And as with the previous one, you have your components, your activities, your due diligence. And let's just, to not waste too much time, you go through the tool and you come to the last question of the 6. And then you end up with a screen that shows you for all those questions where you said, oh no, I haven't really considered that aspect. It lists all those ones, and through the view guidance button, you get back to those screens that help you. So that is in a nutshell this tool, and you can restart it and play with it as often as you want. And those of you who are heavily involved in conservation standards, you would know the team readiness flowchart that is in the pre-planning step. So it's borrowing a bit of that approach of team readiness, and it marries it with those principles and practices and facilitation tips that were developed part of this project. I stop here also and see whether anybody has any questions or put anything in the chat while I was talking about those things. Or are there any comments from anyone?
Frank, I'll just summarise. There's been a bit of an active conversation just about that term territory and the relationship between the term territory and, say, the term country in Australia. They're analogous, but the difficulty you're finding in a term that is universal.
Yeah. And this is exactly like where all your feedback becomes really valuable, because no matter in how many different areas we have worked, we always look at it through our perspective, through our viewpoint. So the more feedback and the more we can ground this in the realities of everyone, the better. So we did not expect that today we gather all the feedback and we're out of here and the tool will be packaged up and sent out on Friday. That was never the intent. And what we had planned is, I think you should see my screen. Looks. we need to trial and we need to get more comments. We need to get more feedback. We have another session in about 12 hours time with our friends from the Americas who will have the same opportunity to provide feedback in the session. But there's only so much that we can expect to get done in 30 minutes, 40 minutes of looking at a tool. Those tools mature most and best from people using them and trialing them in their specific context and then providing feedback to us. We mentioned to you beforehand, we will keep this Miro board open and accessible for everyone, and we will share with everyone after the webinar as well the link so that you don't have to rely on the meeting chat here. And we will equally at the end of this at the end of this consultation this week, make those tools available that you can actually download them and use them. So this is at the moment optimistic thinking, but I hope that you're not falling off your chair, Stuart, but I do hope that we can kind of host those things by the end of the week, at least kind of provide people with a link to the tools. And those are then the versions where we already make sure we incorporate any big pieces of feedback that we get from today or tomorrow. If there's something in there that is extremely upsetting, we'll keep that out. But the idea is by the end of the week, you will have access to the tools. To do that, we have set up a homepage on our top homepage, a little side page, where you will get, as somebody who registered for the webinar, you will get a link to our homepage where you can download the tool, a copy of it. And then you can play with it and provide your feedback on the Miro board. You can equally just send us an email if that is easier. If something doesn't work in the Miro board for you, we are happy to receive feedback whichever way. To get to our homepage, I will just quickly pop in the chat our link as well. And that link brings you directly to that page. We have as well on there the recordings from all the other webinars, and we will post the recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel. What is not so relevant for those of you who sat on this webinar, but for those of you who registered and who couldn't make it. Yeah, so those are kind of the pathways how you can provide feedback to us. Stuart, what else have I missed regarding the feedback aspect?
No, I think that's it. Again, I'm not sure if it's Celeste or Gemma or Celeste, but one of the Celestes has asked when we plan on trialing it, yeah, I think yeah, as Frank said, we're wanting to make it available so you can have a play with it, and if you want to, my feeling is if you want to have a play with it with a real life project, even more better. But it's still, you know, just note that they're still very much in draft. So, you know, things will change, but they'll change from practice more than anything else. So at least the Excel one, because it's fairly simple. So we sort of encourage use, but you know, from whenever. But I think Sebastian, you probably should talk about sort of formal release.
The formal release, we have to think about that still, like what will be in the strategy. But this is intended, as we talked, as a tool to be used by TNC teams, but also externally. It's for the conservation community, and it's to support Indigenous leadership and self-determination and conservation, and like that respectful approach of I don't know, respectful way of approaching when doing this sort of projects on Indigenous territories. So we have to think still about the strategy for sending this around, and also for the piloting phase. And we'll keep you linked into this. But since we have your email addresses and you've been collaborating, like we'll make sure that this all gets to you and see ways for collaborating. So yeah, still many things to define, and it's good to see. I know Frank and Stewart, it's a big challenge to summarize so many things in a call. Yeah, and we didn't see like the actual tools. We did like a run through and explanation of those tools, but we expect to have this ready ideally by beginning of February next year. So we'll keep you posted on this final drafts and continue to improve them through practice.
Can I just clarify? So we'll get an email with this tool, draft tool. Is that what? Yep, we'll get an email. And we can utilize that to just test how it works. Yep.
Yeah. So we just make the tool available. Like we do, I guess, caution if you use it in a real life example. You cannot sue us if something goes wrong and people throw things.
No.
No, but the idea is, yeah, we make this kind of this first prototype available as soon as possible. By the end of the week, you have access to the board, to the tool, and the kind of those guidance documents I spoke to you about beforehand. They will not be ready by Friday. Those are the things Sebastian referred to as well that probably take until early next year because I guess they need a bit of editing and design and layout and all this kind of stuff that takes up a lot of time and to make things look pretty.
Yeah, especially with our team, the Indigenous Landscapes team, we've tried to create something internally ourselves, nothing like this, but like it's a little bit like a risk factor equity matrix that we've sort of used in back of house with some of our projects. But this would work really well with our team because all of our projects are with Mob. There's no projects that we do that are not with Mob. But really cool. I'm so glad I jumped on. This is great. I actually really love it. Amazing.
Very good. Glad that it makes sense and it's helpful. And we used like some, Luke gave me a lot of those materials that the landscapes team did over the years. So they all kind of are influencing our thinking as well. Like this is all kind of a cross-pollination from all different sides.
We can really tell. I love it. It's really, really inclusive. The risk factor matrix that you have is really amazing. The risks, the levels of risks, the low risk, high risk are really, really good. So how good, how good. So we'll get an email, we can trial it. As long as we don't sue you, everything's fine. And great. Sounds good to me. Amazing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Betty. And thanks Yves for joining as well. I'm glad that you could make it.
All right.
Frank, well, so just as a reminder, the mural board will be kept open to get additional comments. If anyone wants to provide further feedback on ideas, I know that you didn't actually see the real tools, just like the walkthrough, but any ideas at this point or I don't know, suggestions, red flags, anything that can contribute to the process would be just great. And thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, so we will, in the email, there will be a link on the homepage. There will be a link to download the tools. And there's equally on the Miro board for the tool that Valentina developed as well a link and to play with it as it is right now. And by Friday, we're going to have it as it is based on the feedback from everyone. And with that, I would like to say a big thank you to all of you who came on a evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world, joining us for this webinar.